r/NoSleep. Posted by u/theeldridgehorror. My granddad left a diary to us and some of the entries in it are very strange. For context, we just inherited my granddad's old house in Indianapolis. I drove Susie and kids down as a family outing to check it out and I wound up going off on my own. I was uprooting around in the attic, searching through an old trunk of my granddad's personal effects, 'cause you know, old people have cool stuff sometimes. Right at the bottom I found this old diary. At first I was like, so what, a diary? But then I started going through it and a couple of the entries he put in here are honestly freaking wild. I felt like I had to post it here because, well, it's just too weird to keep to myself. Hope you enjoy it. July 2nd, 1928. Strange day today, damn strange and unsettling. I know I oughtn't to curse, but if it isn't my diary and events don't warrant it, I'll be the son of a monkey's uncle. I was making the usual rounds traveling the old backroads of Indiana looking for rubes and I wasn't making any headway. Nobody was buying. Had 3 doors slammed in my face at least. I'd have thought your garden variety Midwestern hick would be clamoring for an encyclopedia set. Shows what I know. In any case, I found myself driving through this little town. Little isn't quite the right word. It was big enough, plenty of fancy houses and a big old general store. But the whole place had a queer kind of lifelessness to it which made it seem small and mean. There was a brownness about the place, I'm not sure how else to put it. It just didn't feel quite right. The lawns were all dead and there was an odd funk in the air, as of rotting garbage or some such. I didn't see a single person as I drove through. Even for a hot summer day, that struck me as peculiar. There was something else, some niggling force that was driving me towards the middle of the town. It was the strangest feeling, but I resisted it and cut around the outskirts, near to the cornfield. The corn itself was dead and brittle, jagged and broken in places like teeth as though it had been left abandoned. The whole experience gave me the willies. In any case, I skedaddled through the place as quickly as I could. I was not more than half a mile away when I happened upon a little farmhouse. You couldn't picture a prettier scene, tidy little hedgerows, a nice shiny tractor and a brick red painted barn. Now, I thought, here's a mark if ever I saw one. Despite what you may have heard, rich farmers always spare a little extra to educate themselves. As I pulled into the generous driveway, lane with fresh gray gravel, one odd thing did stand out to me. And I literally mean stand out. Behind the house, looming out like a giant amid the knee-high cornfield that grew around it in rich abundance, a huge sunflower poked its face out. And I do mean giant. Its diameter must have been 2 feet across and it seemed to turn slightly as I approached. I was a little taken aback, sure, but it takes more than a big flower to set me on my rump. So, I put on my pork pie, straightened my suit, checked my wingtips and marched up to the door like I was Thomas E. Dewey himself. I rapped sharply 3 times. Within a matter of seconds a small bespectacled gentleman answered the door. He had a pert little mustache that twitched with a tick when he listened and bobbed when he spoke. I asked him his name. He told me it was Ernest Fowler. Then I started writing on my spiel about what a lovely house it was and how a man who kept such a neat and respectable house must be equally fastidious about the keeping of the hedgerows of his mind. He seemed surprised and somewhat flattered to have anyone visit at all and promptly invited me in to have a cup of coffee. I walked in and, having been invited to do so, nestled myself in an armchair. From separate rooms we discussed the intemperateness of the July heat and whether we thought our beloved Indiana ABCs had a chance this year as he brewed the coffee. We both thought they didn't. I'll admit, my curiosity had been piqued by the giant sunflower in his yard. Perhaps he was a prize flower grower. People rarely pass up the chance to talk about their passions, so I inquired lightly of its genesis. Just as predicted, he perked up. "Notice the flower, did you?" he said. I admitted that it was hard to miss. "There's a sad story about that flower." He asked me if I had been through the nearby town of Samson. I said, yes, indeed I had passed it just minutes ago heading north. I neglected to compliment it on its winsome appeal as I had his own house because, as I've just recounted, it had rather a nasty and derelict demeanor on the whole. Now, if there's any one thing the would-be salesman avoids like the plague, except for possibly the unbidden use of a prospect's restroom facilities, it is being caught out in an obvious lie. It categorically demolishes any trust already built. He nodded and asked me if I knew what had occurred in the town. I confessed that I did not. What had happened? Then I snuggled into the couch, sipped my hot coffee and settled in for a yarn. The best way to build trust is to let a prospect talk, and the best way to get them to talk is to have them tell you a story. Mr. Fowler's mustache twitched again in that slightly disturbing fashion and he sighed heavily. It was not a nice story, he told me, and not one he had told often. But since we were both men, and I had been so kind as to visit with him, he thought it was appropriate that he recount it. It weighed heavily on his mind, he said, and so the telling would be a blessing. I studied my nails while he made these, I felt, somewhat overly intimate confessions. It had all started, he said, when an old woman had come to the town of Samson. The crone was dressed in ragged old clothes with a scarf tied around her head in the old style. She had a big old crooked nose and carried a single cloth bundle tied to a stick in place of a knapsack, you know the kind. She had hitched a ride into town, a vagrant, and asked around for lodgings. Though she had no money to speak of, she would gladly trade the tiny sunflowers she had kept for the right to board the night. She told the townsfolk they would bring good tidings. The people of Samson, hard-nosed commercial types mostly, who populated the prosperous corn and livestock town at the time, turned up these hard noses at the vagabond and suggested she move along while the daylight was good. There was something strange about her having sunflowers this time of year, as they don't get a good growth on them until September, and these ones were particularly bitty. Barely the size of daisies. Millie Hoggart even went so far as to swing a handbag at the old woman and called her a louse and a bum. The itinerant personage did not respond in kind, but graciously continued down the road. As it happened, Mr. Fowler was driving back to his house on the edge of town when he saw this little spectacle. As a man of the word and a self-ascribed good Samaritan, he told the old woman she was welcome to hitch a ride out of town and stay with him. It was little more than an old shack, he told her, but he had a guest room that he trusted would suit her needs. She consented, gratefully and effusively, and they made their way there. To this day, he cannot remember her name, but they talked of a great many things, of the price of corn, gasoline and manners. This third they agreed was free. She told of her life as a traveler and how she had been on the move since she was very young. A sort of wanderer is how she described herself, and a fortune-teller of sorts. Taking his palm in hers, she predicted that Mr. Fowler, a bachelor of around 40 at the time, would be very fortunate indeed. As for the town of Samson, her eyes went very narrow and she parsed out in a thin cracked voice, I cannot say as much of the folk of that town. He made them both dinner and saw her off to bed around 10. When he woke up the next morning, he found a single small sunflower on the table in a vase. The old woman and her knapsack had quite disappeared. There was something strange about the sunflower. It moved as Fowler walked about the room, in the way that a sunflower will follow the sun, but faster. At first it gave him the heebie-jeebies. He felt vaguely vexed by the blank reticulations of the flower's face stalking his every move. Soon enough, though, he began to warm to the thing. He even gave it a name, Fred, and decided to keep it for a pet. Fowler made his way into Samson that day to peddle sell some hogs, for he, like many of the surrounding folk, kept a few animals on the property as well. As he drove through, he saw that many of the shops and houses appeared to have taken a battering. Hail it had been, Joey Osmond told him, great chunks of it falling from the sky, some of them as big as a baby's head. This seemed unlikely to Fowler. After all, he had not heard a lick of it, and from the damage, the heart of the storm would not have been 2 miles from his house. Besides, who heard of a hailstorm in mid-May? But Doc Abernathy corroborated Joey's story and said the whole town had been hiding in their basements, shaking like little children. It had sounded as though the fist of God himself were pounding down on their homes. For a brief second, Fowler's mind cogitated on a strange and eldritch idea. But no, that was silly. He bid the townsfolk the best in their recovery. When he returned that evening, he could have sworn Fred the flower had grown half an inch. Very curious. Life went on. The shopkeepers and homeowners in Samson were of course put out by the damage from the hailstorm to their property. But these were affluent, well-to-do people. A few chunks of ice didn't stick in their craw for very long. Soon, the windows were mended, roofs thatched, and business returned to usual. People didn't talk about the old woman, or only in so much as she had appeared at the same time of the storm, as a sort of ill omen. Old Will Fotherington, who owned the local gas and go, complained that gypsies are bad for business. We done well to seen the back of her. He spoke of getting gates and a fence for the town to keep the undesirables out, like those proper rich folk with their gated communities up north. Nobody listened to Old Will much though. Fred the sunflower continued to grow at an alarming rate. Soon, he was too big for the vase in which the old woman had left him. But he had grown on Fowler, so to speak, and the farmer didn't care to see the flower destroyed. So he planted it out in the field with the corn. Almost the second Fred was in the ground, Fowler told me, the flower seemed to quiver with a kind of manic delight, and it rotated a full 360 degrees. This febrile vigor pleased but also unsettled Fowler, who left Fred to settle in. The next day was the big farmers' market in the middle of the town square. For most of the farmers, this would represent the first big harvest of the year for sweet corn, that is the kind edible for humans. When he got in that day, mayhem. Farmers were raving, running about from stall to stall, whispering and yelling, bug-eyed and raving. It seemed that every single bushel of corn that had been harvested the day before had gone bad overnight. Now, picking corn is no easy process. You need to go by with a husking knife, grab the ear, twist it and throw it in the wagon drawn by a team of slow-walking horses. It is very time and labor-intensive. For the entire first harvest of the season to go bad all at once? Unheard of. People were scratching their heads. They couldn't understand. There had been no frost the day before that might have blighted the corn. It was summer for God's sake. Fowler crossed himself after that little outburst. In fact, the only crop that hadn't been ruined turned out to be Fowler's. Suspicious eyes passed over him as he went about selling his wares and tongues wagged behind his back. Why had this little man been spared the blight? He was no more holy than anyone else. Sure, he attended Mass on Sunday, but his piety was no greater than, say, Johnny Wisman, who taught a little Sunday school, or Jude McCoy, who regularly helped out at the soup kitchen. And yet, both those upstanding gentlemen's crop, and a bumper crop at that, had been blighted by the strange sickness. No, it didn't seem right. Didn't seem right at all. Hot dog, fair diary, look at that. It's just about dinner time and I've been fair scribbling in you since just past noon. I guess sometimes the spirit just takes you. Well, guess the rest of this will have to wait until another day.